Everyone knows that Jesus Christ is the centerpiece of the worldwide Christian faith. What is not so well known is the almost universal effort undertaken by critics and skeptics to try and demonstrate not so much that Jesus' teachings were wrong, but that he never existed. What is there about the life of Christ that drives critics and skeptics to try and prove that he never lived at all? Have archaeological discoveries uncovered a living Christ, or just a mythical Jesus? Is there any historical, archaeological, or scientific confirmation that the man known as Jesus Christ actually lived and grew to manhood in the obscure Judean village of Nazareth? Ancient documents, 20th and even 21st century discoveries provide some surprising conclusions in this episode of Ancient Secrets of the Bible. We are about to look through the pages of the first continuous recorded history of mankind in the book we call the Holy Bible, as we continue our investigation into some of its most controversial stories and try to answer some very tough questions. Is the Bible a reliable account of miraculous interventions, of angels, apostles, and the power of prayer? Or is it just a collection of stories and myth, as some modern-day critics suggest? Both Bible skeptics and proponents from around the world have contributed to this exciting discussion. Some of these biblical revelations may shock and surprise you. The overriding questions asked by theologians, scholars, and skeptics for hundreds of years has been simply, did Jesus actually walk the earth 2,000 years ago? Is Jesus Christ the living Son of God, or is he merely a glamorized invention? If it's the latter, somehow his followers have managed to sustain an amazingly popular fiction for nearly 2,000 years. But popularity is not necessarily a sign of historical accuracy, and the historical record regarding a man called Jesus Christ has been the subject of controversy for nearly 20 centuries.
So some people would say, well, if all we've got to go on is the Gospels, then that's not good enough. We shouldn't just believe what the Gospels say. But there are two problems with that. First of all, we have some fragmentary evidence from other historical sources, from Tacitus and from Josephus, where there are references made to Jesus and the community of believers that grew up out of the kind of ministry that he had. And so these are more or less casual allusions to Jesus the man in a larger context explaining the significance of Christianity at the time. They're not within a decade or so of the life of Jesus, but they are treated by historians as historically reliable. The second problem with the other view, the criticism, is that there's no reason why we shouldn't think of the Gospels themselves as historically reliable documents. The reason why some people do is because they think, well, the Gospels have an agenda, and they're designed to create belief in Jesus as the divine Son of God. Well, now, even if that's the agenda, it doesn't mean that the historical claims are themselves false. And so to check that out, you've got to look at the credibility of the witnesses, the quality of the documentation, and so we would examine, for example, whether this gospel or that satisfied the kinds of conditions that have to be satisfied for any ancient document to be considered historically reliable. And the Gospels meet these conditions in spades.
Was there an itinerant Jewish preacher who challenged both the might of Rome and the power of the Jewish Sanhedrin 2,000 years ago? Let's see if we can find some answers. What little we think we know about the life and brief ministry of Jesus Christ is primarily contained in a record called the Synoptic Gospels, here in the New Testament of the Bible. But the question is persistently asked, was there really a man called Jesus Christ? And if there was, what was there about this one man living in an isolated corner of the globe that still manages to inflame the passions of a worldwide religious following today? Is it even possible to determine if the record is factual? Is there available historical and scientific evidence to support the fantastic claims the New Testament makes about the life of Jesus of Nazareth?
According to scholars, there is no historical evidence that the town Nazareth existed during the early years of Jesus.
That seems to be one of the most consistent arguments advanced by skeptics today. They insist that the village of Nazareth, so prominent in the life of Jesus, didn't even exist when Jesus was born.
It's true that the town of Nazareth is not explicitly mentioned in the Old Testament. However, archaeologists have unearthed remains dating back all the way to nearly 2,000 years before Christ. In the 300s BC, evidence of a continuous settlement has been found. In the 100s BC, extensive remains exist. So there is no question that by the time of the lives of Joseph and Mary and Jesus in the 1st century AD, an established village in Nazareth existed.
What is it that propelled Jesus of Nazareth from being just a carpenter in an obscure Judean village to the world's most prominent historical figure?
Understanding great historical figures to be divine is, in a very important sense, in the eyes of the beholder. Those are responses made to individuals about their significance ultimately. The categories used are not unique to Jesus. Christians must recognize that calling Jesus Son of God is something not applied to Jesus alone, but to other great historical figures as well.
You can look at ancient figures, say the comparison with Buddha, or we could look at modern heroes like, say, Gandhi and Tolstoy or Martin Luther King. And none of them, if you look at the evidence, comes anywhere close to putting a stamp on history as Jesus of Nazareth did. Unique and decisive.
There is one indisputable fact about the life of Jesus that everyone accepts. That is, that the vast majority of everything we know about the life of Jesus is gleaned from the New Testament. But is there other available historical evidence that supports the Bible's authenticity?
The best evidence that Jesus was a real historical character does not come so much from his followers and disciples, but from those who rejected him. His own Jewish people, the rabbis from the 2nd to 5th centuries, wrote about Jesus, wrote about his death, wrote about his miracles, wrote about his disciples, wrote about their death, wrote about their miracles. That's evidence that's reliable.
You know, I find it amusing that 1 or 2 documents found written by someone we know nothing about suddenly constitutes proof of someone or something that supposedly existed over 2,000 years ago. I mean, writers today can't even get stuff right that happened 2 months ago.
Critics would be well advised to avoid attacking the integrity of the New Testament documents. More than 5,000 copies are still in existence today of the New Testament or some portion of it, which is almost 40 times more than we have for any other ancient document. The number of manuscripts preserved of part or all of the New Testament and the number of quotations in the early writers of the Church's history that we have of the New Testament is so numerous that we almost certainly have the correct reading for every doubtful passage in one of those manuscripts, a fact which probably can be affirmed of no other ancient document.
What we have with the New Testament record, apparently, is an enormous amount of documentation produced within 30 to 40 years of the death and resurrection of Jesus. That is far closer to the actual events than any other in recorded history. But there are scholars who still insist that the biblical record is flawed.
I see the Gospels as a combination of history and theology. I sometimes use the phrases history remembered and history metaphorized. By history remembered, I mean some things are in the Gospels because Jesus really said them and did them. By history metaphorized, I mean the early community often used metaphorical stories to talk about the significance of Jesus. So they are a mixture of the two.
Could it be there are two Christs? One, the product of hundreds of years of religious faith, and another that is the real or historical Jesus.
People have tried to take the portrait of Jesus Christ in the New Testament and find the solvent to separate the human Christ from what they call the Christ of faith. No one has been able to do that. The portrait of Christ being divine in the Scriptures is a stubborn one.
Historians and scholars, however, have not relied only on the biblical account of Jesus to help them discover the truth about the man who countless numbers of people over the course of 2,000 years have come to worship as the Son of God. They have also examined the men Jesus gathered around him. The 12 disciples were men of little note, a tax collector, a fisherman, men of the country, all except one, Judas Iscariot, a man of the city. It is the integrity of these men that must be relied upon if the biblical account is to have any validity. It is their writings that have given the world the fantastic stories about the places and events in the life of Jesus, stories that even today create a storm of controversy.
Mighty deeds is the Greek word for it. He was an exorcist. We do believe there is a historical kernel there. And he was a faith healer. People did find healing in his presence. But after his death, other stories got added, such as walking on water. That clearly is a symbolic, some would call mythical story, not a historical event.
The New Testament is both a theological and historical record, but the important thing here is that at points where we can check out the text, the New Testament can be confirmed, and therefore we conclude it's accurate.
2,000 years after the fact, it is, of course, impossible to prove that any of the miracles recorded in the Bible actually occurred. But we do have the testimony of some who were there, people who claim to have actually witnessed these marvelous things. And we have the silent witness of an entire generation.
During the first 100 years following Jesus' death and resurrection, there were no significant refutations of his claims, either in speech or in any other form, even though the establishment of his time bitterly opposed everything he preached and stood for. It would seem that it had been possible to tear down the claims that Jesus made about himself or those made by his followers. Jesus' enemies would have done so immediately. Instead, the prominent historians of the period, all non-Christians, recorded the claims of Jesus and the deeds and events by which they were validated.
Jesus performed miracles, but so did many people in the Jewish world and in the pagan world of his day. So the real question is not, did he perform miracles, but what did people understand the importance of those miracles, Jesus' miracles, to be?
Jesus made utterly fantastic claims about himself, and he backed it up with his words and his deeds, and he proved it by his death and his resurrection from the dead.
If scholars, archaeologists, theologians, and historians are ever going to know for certain whether Jesus actually walked the earth, certain questions will have to be answered. The New Testament, of course, provides the great bulk of evidence regarding the life of Jesus, and rightly or wrongly, religious documents are held to be suspect simply because they are religious documents. Surprisingly, theologians seem to have more trouble with these documents than do historians. Be that as it may, if we are to glean the truth from the available record, at least 3 questions must be considered. First, how soon after the events in question were the records made? Second, how reliable were those who kept the record? And third, are there independent sources that confirm or contradict this history? We have found some surprising answers. Quite probably, a majority of the world's people are willing to accept Jesus of Nazareth as a great moral teacher. However, a smaller percentage accept Jesus as anything more than that. Many still dispute that he ever lived at all. Could it be due to the fact that according to those who recorded his life and ministry here on earth, he makes such fantastic claims for himself? Is there any way 2,000 years after the fact that science or scholarship can verify those claims?
For much of the 20th century, biblical scholars confidently maintained that the Gospels and Acts in their entirety did not exist before the 3rd or 4th decade of the 2nd century of this era, in other words, more than 100 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. This view was not based on historical evidence, documentary evidence. It was based primarily on philosophical preconceptions, even though plenty of evidence existed in the last century that the Gospels were written shortly after the death of Jesus. Now the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that the Gospels and Acts were completed in the mid to late 1st century of this era.
Scholars with over 25,000 manuscripts or portions of the New Testament still in existence to work with have in the New Testament record an enormous amount of documentation produced within 30 to 40 years of the actual event. This is a circumstance unique in historical studies of ancient people and events. Yet there are still scholars who believe the record is flawed.
I don't think Jesus saw himself as the Messiah, or as the Son of God, or as the light of the world, or the bread of life, or any of those other familiar Christian titles. I see the Gospels as a developing tradition that contain earlier layers and later layers. And all the statements which report that Jesus thought he was divine or the Messiah belong to the later layers of the tradition.
The claims Jesus makes for himself far surpass those made by any other man. The details of his life are so open to scrutiny that he is either a megalomaniac or he is exactly who he claims to be. The record may have been made by Matthew, Luke, or John, but there is no doubt as to who is speaking. In Matthew 28:18 he says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Luke tells us in chapter 22, verse 69, that Christ said, "From now on the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." In John 6, verse 35, Jesus says, "I am the bread of life." In chapter 9 of John he says, "While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." And in chapter 10 of John he says, "I and the Father are one." Either the disciples were liars and Jesus was a complete charlatan, or he was exactly what he said he was, the Son of God. He doesn't allow us any other alternatives.
According to the testimony of the men who wrote the record then, they were either eyewitnesses or transcribing the words of those who were actual participants in the events of Jesus' life. And they seem to recognize that those to whom they are speaking were also participants and witnesses. That would hardly seem possible 100 or 150 years after the fact. The Bishop of Lyons in AD 180 wrote, "So firm is the ground upon which these Gospels rest, that the very heretics themselves bear witness to them." Was the good bishop speaking metaphorically? Or are there non-biblical sources that attest to the fact that Jesus was a very real historical figure?
The writings of Flavius Josephus, the well-known first-century Jewish historian, confirm that Jesus existed. They refer to James as the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and describe how he was stoned by the Sanhedrin.
Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman historian who confirms that Jesus was crucified as a criminal under Pontius Pilate. He also tells us that Christianity had its origins in ancient Judea. Christians grew to a vast multitude in Rome itself, in spite of the fact that their founder was executed as a criminal. Suetonius was an official historian of Rome during the reign of Emperor Trajan. Among other things, his writings confirm Luke's statement in Acts 18:2 regarding the expulsion of Jews from Rome by the Emperor Claudius. He also makes it clear that there were a significant number of Christians living in Rome before the mid-60s AD. The writings of Roman governor Pliny the Younger are particularly interesting in view of the teachings presented in the New Testament. According to Pliny, the Christians were a people who loved the truth at any cost. He wrote that they met on a certain day, before it was light, singing a hymn to Christ as to a god, and were bound by an oath not to sin. Pliny the Younger did not know what to think of all this. In fact, a remarkable thing is his comment that true believers could not be forced to worship either the emperor or other gods.
It hardly seems likely that people such as these would take upon themselves an oath and willingly die for something they knew to be a lie. But is it only the ancient historians that support the biblical account?
Modern science also takes a hand in confirming the Gospels, even when the source is secular and often unsympathetic to Christianity. For example, one of the most miraculous aspects of the crucifixion was the darkness that covered the land from the 6th to the 9th hour. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three, record the event. But so did several secular historians, among them a man named Thallus, who lived and wrote in 52 AD, or approximately the same time the Gospels were being written. Critics might argue that Matthew, Mark, and Luke fabricated the whole darkness episode to suit their own purposes. But if so, why would Thallus, a Syrian and a secular historian who was alive at the time, confirm it? And it should be pointed out that these historical witnesses come from original sources.
If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John can be relied upon, and if it can be demonstrated that the account was written well within the first century, and if there is corroborating historical evidence from non-biblical sources, can our modern sciences add anything to the weight of the argument? Are there more modern scientific discoveries that tend to support or contradict the notion that Christ lived? What can we learn from the archaeologists and linguistic scholars who followed a shepherd boy into a long-forgotten cave on the shores of the Dead Sea?
The Qumran community was destroyed in 68 AD by the Romans, but even at this early date, their scrolls may contain references to the New Testament and even Jesus of Nazareth. When the Crucified Messiah scroll was translated, it was considered to be of the utmost and far-reaching significance. This scroll identified the Messiah as the shoot of Jesse, the branch of David, and declared that he was pierced and wounded. This 5-line scroll referred to Isaiah 53, the suffering servant chapter of Isaiah, which identifies the Messiah as one who would suffer for the sins of the people. This is the section of Isaiah that is often heard in Handel's Messiah. He was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. It also identifies the Messiah as the scepter, a leader of the community, and says he was put to death. It would be impossible to imagine a better confirmation of the Gospels in literature outside of the Bible.
This discovery and the eventual sale of those first scrolls led to a scroll rush instead of a gold rush. And of course, this led archaeologists to 10 other caves right there in the same area. Once their value was understood, the Bedouins competed with archaeologists to find more scrolls. While the archaeologists were excavating various caves there in Qumran, the Bedouins were just yards away in Cave 4, where over 800 scrolls were discovered of the Old Testament, and it represented every book found therein with the exception of Esther. Over 50 years have passed since the world-shaking discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but most people are probably unfamiliar with the 5 decades of controversy that have swirled around their dissemination and interpretation. Almost everyone knows about the scrolls, but very few people understand how they influence our understanding of the origin of Christianity, or how these very same scrolls validate, if you will, the Hebrew Bible itself. For the first time in history, scholars had an authentic new perspective of Judaism, if you will, as it existed at the time of Jesus.
In another recent discovery, archaeologists uncovered a family tomb in Jerusalem. Inside was an ornate bone box or ossuary, whose remains indicated that the family was of high influence or wealth. Inside the ossuary were the bones of a man between 60 and 70 years of age. On the outside of the ossuary was inscribed the name of the deceased, Joseph Caiaphas. Here, from both extra-biblical and biblical testimony, were the remains of the very high priest who had said Jesus had to die in place of the nation, and the head of the Sanhedrin who had instigated the plot against him.
Then it would seem that there was, in fact, a historical Jesus. He was a real person, born 2,000 years ago at the beginning of the first century, who, by the sole strength of his character, created a following sufficient to worry the political heads of state in the land of his birth, and even some political heads of state today. It has long been believed that science and religion were mutually exclusive pursuits. Religious goals were simply not compatible with objective scientific requirements. However, modern archaeology, astronomy, linguistics, and the statistical sciences seem to be coming to the conclusion the opposite just might be the case. Scientific investigators very often do confirm the claims of the Bible. Science and religion, it can be said, are really on a parallel course to the same goal, the discovery of truth. Biblical and non-biblical sources alike attest to the ministry of Jesus Christ, his subsequent trial and crucifixion. And continuing studies and archaeological expeditions have demonstrated that Nazareth was indeed a village long before Joseph and Mary came on the scene. It could easily have been their home. Certainly nothing in the record or in the archaeological discoveries suggests anything to the contrary. Of the hundreds of questions that might have been asked about the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, we have only been able to touch on a few. But it is interesting to note that in spite of continued skepticism, application of the most modern scientific and scholarly techniques seem to demonstrate that the biblical record is remarkably accurate. There are other questions for which scientists and scholars are still seeking answers, of course, but there's another aspect of this ongoing search for truth that shouldn't be overlooked. So far, nothing has been discovered that contradicts the biblical account.